When it comes to measuring consumer welfare, on the face of it, this just seems like a very simple task. If the price of a good increases, then that's going to cause, as we've seen in the previous chapters, the consumer to drop down to a lower indifference curve. So their welfare is going to decrease. So that's kind of obvious. So the easy thing to do is just to look at their utility at the new indifference curve minus utility at the old indifference curve. So if the change was a bad change, they're going to be at a lower indifference curve. So the utility level is going to be lower than the old utility. So this number is going to be a negative number. So the negative number represents a loss of utility. So the change was a bad change. On the other hand, if the change, whatever the change was, maybe it wasn't an increase of the price, but maybe it's a decrease of the price. Well, that's going to cause them to move to a higher indifference curve, higher utility, and that's going to be a positive number. So that seems like a pretty easy way to do this. Well, there are two problems with this very simple solution to measuring consumer welfare. First, we don't know what the actual utility functions are. Even if we knew what the consumer's preferences were and we knew their indifference curves, remember, there are many utility functions that represent exactly the same preferences. Second, even if we knew what the utility function was and we pinned down exactly one specific utility function, remember that utility is measured in these fictional units of utils. So if I say that your new utility is 1,000 and your old utility was 900, so the change in your utility is 100. Well, what does that mean? What does 100 utility units mean? We can't really interpret that. So this doesn't really mean anything. So how can we actually make meaningful comparisons between the situation before and the situation after some particular change happens? Well, one thing we could do is measure consumers' willingness to pay. So we can quantify things in dollar terms. So rather than measuring things in these fictional utility units, we can measure things in dollars. So we can certainly understand what it means if you're willing to give up $1,000 for a bundle, and I'm willing to give up only $900 for a bundle, and then you say, well, you value the bundle $100 more than I do. Well, that actually makes sense. So our first measure of welfare is going to be consumer surplus, which is measured in dollars. And it's measured in your willingness to pay. So it's the benefit that you derive from the good minus what you pay for it. Now you've probably seen this in earlier courses, but we'll go over it anyway. So let's suppose you're willing to pay up to $10 for a pizza. Now if you bought the pizza at Domino's for $10, what's the change in your consumer surplus from buying this pizza? Remember, you're willing to pay $10 for it, and it cost you $10. Well, your surplus is zero. You got zero extra value from this transaction. If you hadn't bought the pizza and just kept $10 in your pocket, you'd just be as well off as buying the pizza at your full willingness to pay for it. Now, on the other hand, let's suppose Domino's only charged you $8. Remember, you're willing to pay $10, but they only charge you $8. Well, you have a surplus of $2 now. You're $2 better off for buying the pizza than if you hadn't. If you'd kept $10 in your pocket, you'd be $2 worse off than showing up, buying the pizza for $8, which is actually for you worth $10, but you only paid $8 for it, so you end up with a surplus of $2. And that's what we call the consumer surplus. What's really crucial here is this idea of your willingness to pay. Right? So what are you willing to pay for the goods that you received? So let's take a closer look at willingness to pay. In order to measure this willingness to pay, we use what's called the inverse demand function. Remember, demand, we typically write the quantity as a function of price. But you could just as well solve for price in terms of quantity. So for each quantity, what is the price at which you would be willing to buy that quantity? So you could invert this demand function to get the inverse demand function. So for example, if you had a linear demand function, so the quantity that you demand, Q, is A minus B times P, then you could just solve for P in terms of Q in order to get the inverse demand. So that would just be A over B minus Q over B. So at the price of 5, you're willing to buy 1 pizza. At the price of 4, you're willing to buy 2 pizzas. Which means that for the first pizza, you're willing to pay $5. For the second pizza, you're willing to pay $4. So your marginal willingness to pay, your willingness to pay for the second pizza is $4. So again, this word marginal means for the next one. So your marginal willingness to pay for the second pizza is $4. So let's look at a picture to make this idea a little clearer. Let's suppose this was your demand curve. So you can only buy whole units, let's say. So when the price is above 5, you don't want to buy any of this good. At the price of 5, you're willing to buy 1 unit. If the price were to drop to 4, now you're willing to buy 2 units. At the price of 3, you're willing to buy 3 units. The price of 2, you're willing to buy 4. Price of 1, you're willing to buy 5. And then you don't want to buy any more after that. So your the marginal value you assign to the first unit is 5. The marginal value you assign to the second unit is 4, and so forth. So at a price of 5, you're going to buy 1 unit, and the price of 4, you're going to buy 2 units, and so forth. Your consumer surplus is the maximum amount you're willing to pay minus what you pay for it. So the maximum amount you're willing to pay for the first unit is 5. The maximum amount you're willing to pay for the second unit is 4. The maximum amount you're willing to pay for the third unit is 3. So the maximum amount you're willing to pay for the first 3 units is 5 for the first one, 4 for the second one, and 3 for the third one. So that's 12 in total. Now let's suppose the price of this good were 3. Then from your demand curve, we know that you're going to buy 3 units. Well, how much are you going to pay for the 3 units? The price is $3, so you're going to pay $9 total. Right? So why did you buy 3? Because your marginal willingness to pay for the fourth pizza is less than 3. It's only 2. So you wouldn't buy something if your marginal willingness to pay is less than what it costs, right? The extra value you get from buying the fourth pizza is only 2, but you'd have to pay 3 for it, so you're not going to buy it. So the amount that you pay to acquire these 3 units is quantity times price. So it's 3 times 3, which is 9. So you pay $9 to acquire these 3 pizzas. However, those 3 pizzas are worth $12 to you, which is the area that we had looked at before. This whole area. So if we subtract from what it's worth to you, in other words, what you're willing to pay for the 3 units, if we subtract from that what you actually pay for it, which is 9, we're left with this area. And that's your consumer surplus. So this shaded area up here tells us what your consumer surplus is from buying the 3 units at the price 3. So this consumer surplus consists of 3 parts. It's the consumer surplus from the first unit. Remember, the first unit, you were willing to pay $5 for it, but you only paid 3. So your surplus from the first unit is 2. 5 minus 3. Your surplus from the second unit you were willing to pay 4, you only paid 3, so you get a surplus of 1. Surplus from the third unit, well, you were willing to pay 3, you paid 3, so you don't get any surplus from it. So it's 0. You add those 3 things together, those 3 parts together give you a total surplus of 3. So there's a few equivalent ways we could define this. The consumer surplus is, like I've said in the previous slides, it's the extra value you get after paying for the amount of the good that you would like to buy at the given price. Another way of saying this is, what are you willing to pay for the right to buy at that price? So if I told you, I'll sell you the right to buy pizzas at $3, how much are you willing to buy this membership? I'll sell you a membership to my club, which sells pizzas at $3. How much would you pay for that? Well, if your demand curve were the one we looked at, you'd be willing to pay $3 for it. So you could think of the consumer surplus as your willingness to pay for the right to transact at the given price. Graphically, we can just call this the area under the demand curve. So if we draw a demand curve, it's the area under the demand curve, but above the price. If you draw a horizontal line at the price, and you look at the demand curve, it's the area above the price, below the demand curve. Right, so if you had a smooth demand curve, not the step demand curve that we had looked at, this would be your demand curve, and if this were the price, consumer surplus would be, draw a line at the price, you look at the area below the demand curve but above the price, that's going to give you the consumer surplus. Remember, the demand curve tells you what your quantity is going to be, so this is going to be your expenditure. So the area under the demand curve is still your total willingness to pay. So this is still your total willingness to pay. This is still your expenditure, so the difference is going to be your consumer surplus.